Quick video today just to discuss a little bit more in detail about the 2D panel layout inside the ePlan environment. So we're not talking about the Pro Panel application, we're talking about the 2D panel layout. Um, this application is very basic, but it still gets the job done. So what are some of the disclaimers that you got to go through? So basically, one of the things that you need to do if you don't have it, if you're not using retail panels or something like that, or whatever's found on the data portal, you need to bring it in, such as the Hoffman stuff. What you can do is you can actually create yourself a project macro. So I just created here a macro project, and this is basically just very simple. Inside the properties of the project, this is set as being a macro project. So as you know, when you're creating macros, the best, I guess, workflow is to have a macro project available. So there you manage all your macros. And basically all this is just an import. So it's just inserting a graphic from a DXF and what this really is basically just downloading some of the stuff that was available from the internet. So basically you just go into wherever Hoffman's site is available. I have here the Hoffman site, and basically just go to the downloads, download the 2D DXF CAD file. Um, I have that in a folder, and basically just inside your downloads, once you have that downloaded, you can go ahead and fetch that information if ever you need to get that information downloaded and basically just unzipped. And it's basically the DXF file. Once you bring that in, there's here, let me show you how to do that. So just going to go into my downloads folder that I just downloaded, but of course, this is going to be probably something that I need to unzip. So it was in a zipped folder, and just going to make sure I decompress that, extract, put that in the same folder. And once that's done, I have access to that folder here now, and can grab that DXF. One of the disclaimers I really highly recommend is when you're importing or downloading stuff such as DXF files, ideally the file should be clean. Since it is not a native, ePlan is not a native DXF file, I guess, generator, if you will. There's some issues where sometimes if the file has not been lines haven't been broken or things haven't been done properly, like explode or some other you know uh, functions that you need to do to clean up the DXF you'll notice that sometimes with the preview on, it won't show up. So there's something wrong with that file. Either open it up in draft site or AutoCAD or whatever, clean it up, make sure it's as basic as you possibly can have it, and then just bring that in. And basically that's what I did. And when I brought that in, you do have some settings, and of course I had some settings here to um, basically change the scaling format. I do have my panel, and this is the back plate. So I noticed that one thing that I noticed when I brought this in, of course, DXFTWG's files are not necessarily one-to-one inside the ePlan environment. They'll be one-to-one based on the page size, and in this particular case, the page size is slightly bigger for the back plate as opposed for the whole panel. So what I ended up doing is I just basically did I resized it to the size of the panel, so now that it'll be the same size as the back plate will be the same size as the panel. So I just messed around with the scaling to make sure that I got that right, so that when it comes in, it should sit pretty much the way it's supposed to sit here on the back plate, and so on and so forth. All right, so very simple. I brought in the DXF for the panel, brought in the DXF for the back plate, and all I did really is basically just assign a macro box around the back plate, gave it a name, gave it a variant. What I ended up doing in this particular case, kept the same name and give it a different variant. So this is my variant A, my variant B, and my variant C. So basically when I bring this device in, and I'm using this particular macro, I'll be able to hit the tab key and cycle through the different options that are available. So these are very basic functions when you're creating macros inside ePlan. I'm not going to dive into that too much, but it's straightforward. just make sure you have a macro box. And of course, once you have your macro box, you can either select the page, go to project data, macros, and generate automatically. You'll notice that the pages will be highlighted. You can always apply to entire project if you want to do the whole thing, and those macros will be automatically generated. The next step from here, what I did is I actually created a parts database. Parts database, of course, as you all know, uh, Microsoft is mostly focusing on SQL, so we highly recommend the SQL Express environment. Um, One of the aspects that you can take a look at, where's my web page here? Just for your information, you can go here to, there is a web page now. You can copy the link probably if you want, and it's an information portal. It's very interesting. There's a lot of data, a lot of information there, installation guides, especially if you're doing like SQL, you can always access, how to download, how to install, how to change my parts database. A lot of people are still stuck using Access. Unfortunately, Access, of course, it's outdated and it's very archaic and it's got a huge number of limitations. Microsoft SQL Express is free, so super robust, clean system, and of course, everyone's going that route, whether it be other software applications, or they're all pretty much going SQL. So we highly recommend that. So being that said, I created a parts, and basically in my parts database, all I really did is I created here a component, which was for my housing here. Whoops, these are the retail parts. Um, I have here my Hoffman enclosure that I created, and this is basically my back plate that I used here, and basically just created. I copied a retail one that was there, so I didn't really want to break my head too much with it, and just added a part number, made sure it was mechanical type, assigned some instruction or some information, and the most important one was this one right here. So the macro that was created, which is this my back plate, which was generated from a macro project. I assign it here. I copied a little image from the Hoffman website, which gives you the image of the backplate. So basically just grabbed this guy right here, which we looked at earlier here. I just basically saved the image and then put it in my, assigned it to my part inside ePlan. Give it a width, height, depth, basic information, and that's pretty much it. So nothing else really. I could have attached some documents and whatnot, but just keeping it very, very straightforward. So once that's created and assigned to your part, the next step, of course, is inside a project. So here I have a small demo project that just, very basic devices and parts and whatnot. And of course, what I'm going to do, I'll just close this macro project, don't need it anymore. I'll create a new page. The page that you're going to use for a 2D panel layout is panel layout. If you were doing 3D, you'd be using a model view because you can auto-generate 2D models based out of a 3D environment. So that's why Pro Panel is really the way to go. There's so many benefits, so much more flexibility, so much more productivity functionality that it's a no-brainer. Especially we've seen a lot of our a user base that is basically just small mom and pop shops that are just growing exponentially because they can actually benefit from all the things that Pro Panel can offer them. But in the case of doing 2D panels, so I'm going to grab here panel layout, 2D panel layout, just gave it standard name. I also know that I'm going to scale this page, make it bigger because it is a 30 by 36 panel. So I'm just going to make sure I change the scale factor from 1 to 2. When you're doing 2D panels, you need to include this mounting panel 2D zone. So you have to bring this in. It's a must. So you have to assign this area. If you have the back plate, the side view, the front view, and so on and so forth, so you have to bring in, you'd have to create more of these mounting panel 2D views. Bring in this mounting panel zone. You can give it a name, so I can call this back plate, if you will. Maybe make the text a little bit bigger if you want to be a little bit more. Let me do this above. going to put this upper center. This is also going to be upper center, lower center. So the text will be in the middle. And of course, I'm just going to make that text, I don't know, make it about an inch big. There you go. And all I got to do now is insert my backplate. So I'm going to insert device, select my backplate, the one that I created earlier, this one here, and that'll come in pretty flush. But you have to make sure it fits inside. If ever you decide to stick it anywhere outside or partially outside, you'll get an error message just like this one. So it's completely not inside the box. So make sure you put it inside the box. So just position it somewhere inside. There you go. And yeah, so once you're there, you're ready to start placing your components on your back plate. If there are certain things, of course, as like any um, um, anything inside ePlan that you don't want to display. So basically here under format, if you wanted to, you can actually go here and make it invisible. So, you know, I don't want to see the box. Fine, you don't want to see the box. You just want to see the back plate. That's great. But you have to have these boxes around it. Some users have this tendency of basically just make them all invisible and sorry, delete them all. And nah, that's not the way to go. You need to have them. The system needs to have those in the background. In order to basically associate what components are inside this zone. So you can make them invisible, but hey, you know, that's just graphics. So um, to start placing a DIN rail. So one of the disclaimers with DIN rails and wire ducts is that in the panel 2D as opposed to the Pro panel, this has to be a rectangle. So it's either a rectangle or a line. There's no real smarts to it, unfortunately. It wasn't conceived that way. It was it's very basic just to put objects and basically assign positioning, dimensioning, and so on and so forth. So guys in the shop floor can have a base understanding of where to do this. So just like any other drafting tool that you can just draw polylines and squares and text and rectangle, it's kind of the same base principle. This environment came out in as of 1.7, which is almost like 10 years ago. So you can understand where, you know, development wise, this is not something that they were really focusing on. That's why, again, Pro panel is the way to go. In this particular case here, so just, you know, drawing a rectangle. If you want to be more explicit on the particular size that you want to use for your wire duct, well, you'd have to type it in. So I want a 1.5 inch by whatever 29. That's fine. Leave that as is. So I can modify that stuff around. And again, it's very graphic based. There's no real logic to it. You can basically, there's no part data you can assign to. At any point in time, if you did want to, for your bill of materials, assign this to be a part, what you'd have to do is inside the 2D panel layout, you'd have to, sorry, not in the 2D panel layout, I'm talking about in the bill of materials navigator. You'd have to, for all the parts that have been used inside your project, you'd have to add a new project part. This project part would be your DIN rail or your wire duct, and then you'd have to specify that that belongs inside your project so that it can be used in a bill of material. So a little bit of a manual work in that case, but yeah, that's kind of the limitations of the functionality that you have. But for visual representation wise, yeah, this is just, you wanted to show that there's a wire duct there. You wanted a dimension that wire duct for you know, whatever reason. That's something that you can do. So it's not that big of a deal. Just change the dimension to be set here. I don't know, to millimeters or inches or whatnot. So yeah, graphic wise. Now, again, for the wire duct, it's a, sorry, that was for the wire duct. For the DIN rail, similar rule applies. So you make a rectangle, or other users like to use a line. So just drop in a line just as a guide of where the components are going to go. And then, of course, you bring up the 2D panel layout navigator where you can select where your components, and basically you can start to grab your components from this navigator and just drag and drop them out. Now, of course, they'll be tied to the schematic. So whatever is that I'm placing will be tied to the schematic. In when you drag it out, you can eyeball it and position it where you deem that it should go. Another nice feature that I like in this particular case is I can actually go here and place on mounting rail. The system is asking for the auxiliary line, so this is only going to work if you put this on a rectangle or on a line. So I'll select my line here, and then basically I can just say I want to position somewhere about there. I click and it'll automatically snap to that line. So this is partially some of the limitations again that it has, but at least it positions it centered onto that line. It comes in with the data associated about that device. I just hit the invisible line. And basically from here, you can actually go ahead and jump. So I can say here, go to counterpiece, and it'll actually jump to my schematic. So there is a tie between those two. But yeah, so it's still, mostly there for dimensioning and positioning purposes. Same rule applies for terminal strips. So terminal strips, if you grab a terminal strip, you'll notice that it'll ask you to place the whole thing. If you say yes, it'll actually give you the size of the terminal strip. So it's not necessarily going to give you every single slice one by one. So this, again, other parts of doing things in a 2D environment. If you were to grab and you wanted to be a little bit more graphic, I guess you wanted to see this a little bit more graphically oriented, you can drag and drop it out, say no. You will have an error message because there is no macro tied to that part until you tie a macro. I just have the dimensioning. So I can go ahead and place this on my thin rail. And of course, yeah, anytime the next one's over will come up and all I have to do is click OK. I still get my error message and then just click, 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 and they'll drop in. In the case of components, so if I actually grab some components like this one here, so these ones do have like a little macro, so it's up to you to assign the macro. Some of these things are available on the data portal. Some you might have to do. So basically, again, DXF, DWGs and bring them in. You can drag and drop it out, or I can actually say here, place on mounting rail, select my rail, and then just start placing them, click, click, and click. So again, there are different aspects of the tool when you're working with this environment. And of course, one of those aspects too is the capability of bringing those in. You will have tie from this environment to the schematic, so that's pretty good. You will still be able to do an enclosure legend and see the components that are inside the backplate, but pretty much in a nutshell, this is the workflow that you would take when you're doing 2D panel layouts. There'll still be a little bit of lines that you might have to trim. So unfortunately, unlike you generating model views, if you will, in a pro panel environment, you still have to do some lines or some editing. There's a little bit of work here involved. So I can use my edit tool line, and maybe I can use here my cut trim, and I can cut that line off and cut that line off again to make it a little bit more clean. So a little bit of work I got to do here just to clean that up, make it somewhat maybe more graphically oriented. Um, Issue here, of course, is if I moved something around, those lines are cut, so I'm gonna have to redraw that line or whatnot. But basically, in a nutshell, you still have the capability of working with the tool. But yeah, there are some limitations to how to or how to use the tool. So hopefully this gives you an idea, an understanding of the 2D panel layout functionality. Again, you still have the navigator, which is great. I can drag and drop. I still have the link between the devices from the panel layout to the schematics, so there's a tie there. That's pretty good. You can still do enclosure legends. You can generate them, and of course you can you can still do work in this fashion. So hopefully this again gives you a little bit more of an understanding, and yeah, we'll be looking forward to the next little tip tutorial that I'll be doing. Thank you. Have a good one.